One betrayal, one breaking point, one deadly trap. That's all it takes to transform neighbors into killers and co-workers into executioners. Where carbon monoxide becomes a silent assassin, concrete becomes a liquid tomb, and the very tools of survival become instruments of calculated murder. It was March 12, 2015, in western Pennsylvania, as a winter storm moved through the region, knocking out power across multiple neighborhoods and forcing residents to rely on emergency heating and backup electricity. Snow and ice accumulated rapidly, and by nightfall, entire streets sat dark and silent under deteriorating conditions. Santry Pike was 34 years old and worked as a maintenance technician for a local facility. He lived in a duplex on Maple Street, sharing the building with 59-year-old Harold Metz, a retired factory supervisor. The two men occupied separate units, but shared utilities and access points had become a source of ongoing conflict. Over several months, disagreements over noise, shared spaces, and storm preparations had escalated into persistent hostility. The tension reached a breaking point days before the storm, when Pike reported Metz to the property owner for tampering with shared utility controls. Records later showed that the complaint resulted in a formal warning to Metz. Text messages recovered during the investigation indicated that Metz viewed the report as a personal betrayal and had expressed intent to retaliate during the next major outage. The duplex physical layout played a critical role. Pike's unit relied on a rear steel storm door as its primary exit during power failures, as snow accumulation often blocked the front entrance. The door was secured by a manual latch system accessible from the outside. The basement, where Pike stored emergency equipment, had limited ventilation and a single stairwell leading to the main floor. As the storm intensified on the evening of March 12th, regional power grids failed. Pike activated a gas-powered generator in the basement to maintain limited electricity for heating equipment. Investigators later confirmed that the generator was operating as designed. However, carbon monoxide began accumulating due to inadequate ventilation, slowly spreading upward through the structure. Security footage from a neighboring building later showed Metz entering the rear alley during the height of the storm. He was seen positioning a metal bar against the storm door's latch mechanism before leaving the area. The timing coincided with the generator's continued operation inside the duplex. As carbon monoxide levels increased, Pike attempted to leave for his overnight shift. Footage captured his movements near the rear exit as he tried repeatedly to open the storm door. The metal bar wedged against the latch prevented it from opening. His movements became uncoordinated as exposure continued. Pike collapsed on the rear stairwell before reaching the main floor. The obstruction at the exit prevented escape and delayed any chance of outside assistance. The generator continued running until fuel depletion, allowing carbon monoxide to saturate the enclosed space. Emergency responders were alerted the following morning after neighbors noticed the generator had stopped and received no response from inside the unit. First responders found Pike's body on the stairwell near the rear exit. Carbon monoxide readings inside the structure remained elevated, and combustion byproducts from the generator were documented in the basement. The coroner's report confirmed carbon monoxide poisoning as the cause of death. Investigators recovered the metal bar still lodged against the storm door latch and obtained phone records showing Metz's messages referencing retaliation during the storm. The physical evidence established that Pike had been deliberately prevented from exiting the building while hazardous conditions developed inside. Metz was charged with third-degree murder for deliberately blocking the exit while knowing a generator was running inside. He was convicted and sentenced to multiple decades in prison for what prosecutors called calculated retaliation, not an accident. But Pike wasn't the only victim whose trust proved fatal. In Atlanta, a construction foreman was about to discover that cutting corners on safety could create the perfect opportunity for deadly revenge. It was August 22, 2016, at a downtown construction site in Atlanta, Georgia, where summer heat had baked the soil dry and compact around a 15-story office building still months from completion. The project was behind schedule, and crews had been working extended shifts to keep underground utility work on track before concrete pours began. The site required multiple trenches dug along the eastern perimeter of the building, some reaching depths of nearly 12 feet to accommodate electrical conduits and water lines. According to federal safety standards, any excavation deeper than 5 feet required protective shoring to prevent soil collapse. On this site, steel trench panels and hydraulic braces were used, but inspections had been inconsistent as deadlines tightened. Darrow Clint, 41, served as head foreman and was responsible for approving trench setups before crews entered them. Workers later described Clint as dismissive of safety concerns, often pushing installations forward even when protective systems were incomplete. Complaints about his management had circulated quietly among the crew for months, but few were willing to challenge him directly. Tommy Rodriguez, 25, operated heavy equipment on site and had clashed repeatedly with Clint over denied overtime and delayed safety requests. In the weeks leading up to the incident, the tension escalated. Rodriguez believed Clint was deliberately blocking his advancement and had threatened to ensure he would never work another major construction project in the city. 3 days before the trench collapse, an argument between the two men was witnessed by several co-workers near the equipment staging area. After that confrontation, Rodriguez was reassigned to excavator duties along the eastern trench line, where he had early access during morning setup. On the day of the incident, the trench had been dug to full depth, but the shoring system was improperly installed. One steel panel along the north wall was not fully secured, and the spacing between supports did not match the soil conditions, which consisted of dense clay layered with loose fill from previous excavation. Despite this, Clint approved entry into the trench to verify conduit placement. A documentation camera mounted near the edge of the excavation captured the early stages of the collapse. As Clint moved along the trench floor, the unsupported section of wall began to bow inward. Within seconds, thousands of pounds of soil broke free and poured into the excavation, bearing him from the waist down and pinning his chest against the opposite wall. Workers heard Clint shouting briefly before the remaining soil settled. His hard hat and one shoulder remained visible above the collapsed edge, but the trench walls continued to shift, making immediate rescue impossible. Attempts to dig by hand were stopped due to the risk of a secondary collapse that could bury additional workers. Emergency responders arrived and secured the area, bringing in specialized vacuum excavation equipment to remove soil safely. The recovery took several hours. Clint was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later confirmed compressive asphyxiation as the cause of death, noting that the pressure of the soil prevented his chest from expanding, causing suffocation within minutes. The investigation determined that the trench had been approved despite clear safety deficiencies, including missing locking components and improper panel spacing that did not match the soil conditions. Equipment logs showed that Rodriguez had been responsible for early setup along the north wall of the trench and had bypassed a required locking pin on one steel panel, a step necessary to stabilize the shoring system. Phone records showed that Rodriguez had searched for information related to trench collapses and excavation failures the night before the incident. Investigators also recovered messages sent to co-workers expressing anger toward Clint and resentment over repeated threats to his career. While no direct confession was found, the combination of intentional safety tampering, access, and prior conflict supported the conclusion that the collapse was not accidental. Rodriguez was arrested and charged with felony murder, with prosecutors arguing that Clint's death occurred during the commission of a criminal act involving deliberate safety sabotage. A jury later convicted him, and he was sentenced to decades in prison. But Clint wasn't the only victim targeted for their professional authority. Over 1,000 miles away in New Mexico, an environmental specialist would discover that some conflicts with locals leave no room for escape. It was October 5th, 2017, when the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rugged terrain of a state hiking preserve in New Mexico. The desert landscape stretched for miles, punctuated by steep cliff formations and narrow canyon approaches that had challenged hikers for decades. Temperatures hovered around 78 degrees, and a recent flash flood earlier in the week had shifted surface rock near several junctions, subtly altering familiar sightlines along the trail. Morel Trope, a 28-year-old environmental specialist, had become a familiar presence on these trails over the past 2 years. Her athletic build and methodical approach to hiking reflected her professional background in conservation work. She frequently documented trail conditions and reported vandalism to park authorities, earning both respect and resentment from various user groups. The preserve's trail system relied on a network of high-visibility directional markers positioned at critical junctions, particularly near cliff zones, where wrong turns could prove fatal. These metal posts, painted bright orange and installed after previous near-miss incidents, had been vandalized repeatedly in recent months. Trope's conflict with Cole Avers, a 32-year-old local resident, had escalated over several weeks following her reports of unauthorized off-trail vehicle activity. Avers, who worked in construction and spent weekends riding in the preserve, had grown increasingly hostile toward what he viewed as interference with his recreational activities. Text messages recovered from Avers' phone revealed escalating hostility toward Trope, including statements about redirecting her toward the ridge approach. Additional messages referenced the cliff junction specifically, noting that the route had caused serious injuries in the past and warning that a wrong turn there could be deadly. That afternoon, Trope began what she intended as a routine solo hike along the ridge trail system. The route, which she had completed dozens of times, normally took 3 hours and offered spectacular views of the surrounding canyon country. Footage recorded by another hiker filming a landscape panorama from a nearby overlook later helped investigators establish Trope's position and timing along the ridge trail shortly before the incident. The altered trail marker at the junction was documented separately during the investigation. Following the altered marker, Trope entered an unmaintained approach that led toward a cliff zone rather than continuing along the established trail. The terrain consisted of loose scree and talus, unstable rock formations marked as hazardous in park documentation. The rotated marker served as the primary directional guide at the junction due to the natural funneling of foot traffic between rock walls. Any closure notices were positioned further down the closed approach beyond the initial turn and not visible from the main trail. The footage captured the moment when the loose scree beneath Trope's footing gave way. She fell approximately 40 feet onto the rocky surface below, sustaining massive trauma. The injuries were immediately fatal due to the combination of blunt force trauma and the height of the impact. Emergency responders reached the scene several hours later after the hiker who recorded the footage reported the incident. The challenging terrain required specialized equipment, delaying recovery efforts until the following morning. Investigation of the trail marker revealed clear evidence of deliberate tampering. Tool marks on the metal post indicated it had been forcibly rotated using mechanical leverage. The marker's original position would have directed hikers away from the cliff approach. When confronted with the evidence, Avers acknowledged altering the trail marker, but denied intending serious harm. Phone records confirmed his presence in the area on the day the marker was tampered with. Investigators also discovered that Avers had previously ridden his vehicle through the cliff approach area and was familiar with the dangerous terrain. The coroner's report confirmed death by blunt force trauma resulting from the fall. Investigators concluded that the deliberately altered trail marker directly contributed to Trope's fatal deviation from the safe route. Avers was initially charged in connection with the intentional tampering of trail safety equipment. Prosecutors later pursued a second-degree murder charge, arguing that he knowingly created a strong probability of fatal harm by redirecting hikers toward a documented cliff hazard. He was convicted and, citing aggravating factors related to deliberate safety tampering, sentenced to more than 20 years in prison. We've got more disturbing revenge tragedies coming up, so hit that subscribe button if you want to see how betrayal and payback can turn brutally deadly in moments. It was June 3, 2018, when a 12-story apartment building in Denver, Colorado, became the setting for a fatal incident that unfolded quietly inside a stalled elevator. The mid-rise complex housed more than 200 residents and relied on a single passenger elevator for daily access between floors. In the weeks leading up to the incident, tenants had submitted repeated complaints about unexpected stops and brief shutdowns, issues attributed to aging control components. Baxley Gort, 45, served as the building's property manager and had overseen operations for 6 years. His management style emphasized cost containment, often delaying non-emergency repairs. Maintenance logs later showed that several elevator service recommendations had been postponed, including adjustments to door zone sensors and upgrades to the automatic reset system. Steve Walsh, 31, worked as a contracted elevator maintenance technician assigned to the building. Over 3 years, Walsh had submitted multiple reports warning that the elevator's control relays were prone to misalignment and that the automatic restart feature should not be disabled outside of scheduled service windows. His concerns were repeatedly dismissed by Gort, who viewed the recommendations as excessive. The conflict escalated after Walsh's elderly mother, a tenant in the building, was trapped twice in the elevator during separate malfunctions. Following those incidents, Walsh pressed for immediate repairs. Instead, his overtime hours were reduced, and he was warned against filing further complaints. Phone records later showed tense exchanges between the two men in the days that followed. On the afternoon of June 3rd, Walsh accessed the elevator control room under the pretense of routine inspection. Investigators later determined that he placed the elevator into service mode, disabling its automatic restart function, and made a minor adjustment to the door zone sensor that increased the likelihood of the car stopping between floors. The changes did not trigger fault alerts and would appear consistent with routine maintenance activity. That evening, Gort entered the elevator alone in the lobby, intending to travel to the upper floors to address tenant complaints. As the car passed between the 6th and 7th floors, it abruptly halted and entered a locked service state. The doors remained closed, and the car did not automatically reset. Gort attempted to use the emergency call button, which connected to a monitoring service. Records showed that the signal was received, but the call was logged as a non-urgent elevator fault due to the building's prior history of false alarms. The elevator's ventilation fan continued operating, but air circulation was limited. Over the next hour, Gort remained confined inside the stalled car. That evening, Denver was experiencing unseasonably high temperatures, and the elevator quickly became overheated despite limited ventilation. Surveillance footage from the lobby showed maintenance staff assuming the elevator had temporarily shut down and would reset on its own. No immediate rescue attempt was initiated. Inside the car, Gort experienced increasing distress. The medical examiner later noted that he had a documented history of hypertension. Prolonged confinement, rising anxiety, and physical stress likely contributed to a sudden cardiac arrhythmia. After nearly 2 hours, a resident reported the stalled elevator to building security. Technicians manually reset the system and opened the doors. Gort was found collapsed on the floor of the car, unresponsive. Paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene. The autopsy determined the cause of death to be cardiac arrhythmia precipitated by extreme stress during prolonged confinement. There was no evidence of mechanical trauma. The investigation focused on the elevator's control logs, which showed that the automatic restart function had been intentionally disabled earlier that day. Investigators also recovered a jumper wire, bridging the safety circuit, indicating the system had been deliberately bypassed rather than failing naturally. Access records placed Walsh in the control room during the relevant window. Phone messages recovered from his device revealed resentment toward Gort and statements suggesting that being trapped for a while would teach him a lesson. While Walsh denied intending Gort's death, investigators concluded that he knowingly created a dangerous situation by disabling safety features and anticipating a delayed response. Prosecutors argued that the act demonstrated deliberate disregard for human life. Walsh was arrested and charged with first-degree murder under Colorado's extreme indifference statute, with prosecutors arguing that disabling safety systems in an occupied elevator created a grave risk of death. He was later convicted and sentenced to decades in prison, citing aggravating factors related to deliberate safety tampering. The building subsequently replaced its elevator systems and revised emergency response protocols. But Brandon Hale's calculated deception in North Carolina would prove that some acts of retaliation require no mechanical knowledge, only the willingness to exploit a victim's most vulnerable trust. It was May 21st, 2017, in Asheville, North Carolina. Xylee Prant, 26-year-old freelance graphic designer, had spent most of her weekend working from her second-floor apartment. Known for her meticulous attention to detail, she preferred predictability over risk. That preference was survival. She lived with a life-threatening allergy to cow's milk protein that had nearly killed her the year before. Her airway had swollen so rapidly that physicians struggled to stabilize her breathing. Since then, she carried 2 epinephrine auto-injectors at all times and structured her life around avoidance. She verified ingredient lists and refused even thoughtful gestures if she could not confirm their safety. Her breakup with Brandon Hale, a 30-year-old construction worker, had not ended quietly. What began as tension escalated into control, questioning who she spoke to, criticizing her independence, resenting boundaries she set. When she ended the relationship firmly and he refused to accept it, she documented his behavior. 2 weeks before her death, she obtained a domestic violence protective order under North Carolina's 50B statute after repeated unwanted visits. Security footage captured his truck circling the complex. The complaint cost him more than pride. Co-workers became aware. His employer issued a warning. Mutual friends distanced themselves. The separation, in his view, was humiliation. He had been present during her prior allergic emergency and watched medical staff explain how minimal dairy exposure could close her airway. In the months following their breakup, he searched online for information about allergens and whether cooking altered allergenic potency. That Sunday evening, Xylee found a sealed takeout container at her door in an insulated bag. A printed label identified it as dairy-free roasted garlic pasta with almond cream sauce. A handwritten note bore her friend's name, referencing an inside joke. She had confided to that friend earlier about skipping dinner. She sent a brief message of thanks, but received no response. The packaging appeared professional. The ingredient list named almond milk, nutritional yeast, olive oil, garlic, and salt. She examined it carefully. What she could not see was the calculated effort behind it. The label had been printed at home, the note forged, the meal prepared with heavy cream, butter, and Parmesan. After hours of work, and reassured by what appeared legitimate, she allowed herself to trust it. Within minutes of eating, a dry cough developed. Tingling spread across her lips. Swelling followed. Her throat tightened, airflow narrowing. Recognition brought panic. She retrieved her epinephrine auto-injector with trembling hands. As she positioned it against her thigh, her grip faltered, and the device slipped beneath a chair. Dizziness intensified as she reached for it. When she pressed it against her thigh, the device clicked, but her arm jerked, preventing full deployment. Her breathing deteriorated. She dialed emergency services, but speech was fragmented and gasping. Responders arrived 9 minutes later. Xylee was found on her side, cyanosis visible around her lips and fingernails. Paramedics administered epinephrine and oxygen. Her blood pressure had dropped significantly. She lost consciousness. Cardiac arrest followed due to respiratory failure. In the emergency department, intubation proved extremely difficult because of swelling. A surgical airway was performed, but prolonged oxygen deprivation had caused severe brain injury. She was pronounced deceased hours later. Laboratory analysis revealed high concentrations of milk proteins in the pasta, inconsistent with the label. Almond-based components were absent. The label had been produced using a home printer. Surveillance footage showed Brandon Hale purchasing heavy cream, Parmesan, butter, and pasta that day. Digital analysis revealed searches regarding allergen persistence and disguising ingredients. Draft messages reflected resentment over the harassment complaint. The insulated bag matched one in his possession. Label paper and a recently used ink cartridge were recovered from his apartment. Residual sauce in his saucepan chemically matched the sauce in Xylee's container. Prosecutors argued the act was retaliatory. The forged identity, falsified label, and timing established motive. The meal was a calculated instrument of revenge, exploiting a known medical vulnerability. The jury convicted Brandon Hale of second-degree murder, concluding he acted with malice and awareness of the fatal consequences, despite defense arguments that he only intended to make her ill. He was sentenced to 24 years in state prison. Thanks for watching. Want to see more? Click on your screen now.